When a child disappears, every second matters. The people of Willow Creek knew that. Within hours of 7-year-old Clara Jennings vanishing, the entire town was out searching. From church parking lots to storm drains, they scoured every corner. The air crackled with urgency, with the hollow sound of her mother's voice calling a name that never came back. Detective Mara Ellison, weary from years of unsolved files, clung to the only lead she had, her canine partner, Kaiser. The shepherd didn't chase after false scents. He moved with the certainty of instinct, dragging her into a cul-de-sac most had written off. At its end loomed Ashford House, a relic of a fire that never explained itself. Kaiser climbed to the roof, his bark echoing against broken shingles. At first, Mara thought it was madness. Then she felt the chimney, warm, too warm. And from deep inside came a noise that would freeze every heart on the street. A child's voice, whispering through the soot. Clara would be pulled out alive, clutching a music box older than her, whispering a single word that chilled the blood of every officer present. Monster. The last morning Clara Jennings was seen alive began with a grey sky pressing low over Willow Creek, the kind of morning that carried silence heavy enough to feel like a warning. She was only 7, small for her age, with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she trotted down the cracked sidewalk toward school. The pink hoodie she wore, embroidered with a glittering unicorn, was a gift from her mother's night shift wages, a simple piece of clothing that suddenly became unforgettable. Neighbors remembered her smile that morning. One said she waved, shy but cheerful. Another swore she stopped to pet their Labrador before heading toward the crossing. But by the time the school bell rang at 8:05, Clara's desk sat empty, her chair untouched. By 8:20, her teacher called home. By 8:30, her mother was running through the front door of the school, breathless, clutching her chest. And by 8:42, the Amber Alert sounded on every phone in the county. Sharp, shrill, unavoidable. Amber Alerts aren't just noise, they change the air. At the gas station, drivers lifted their heads from pumps to read the words flashing across digital screens. At the grocery store, mothers gripped their children's hands tighter. Highway billboards carried Clara's name across 3 counties. Missing, Clara Jennings, age 7, last seen wearing a pink unicorn hoodie. The town of Willow Creek responded the way small towns do in the face of crisis. They dropped everything. By 9 o'clock, dozens of volunteers were already fanning out. Farmers in muddy boots, retirees in ball caps, teenagers with flashlights they didn't yet need in daylight. Every backyard was checked, every culvert, every row of hedges. The sound of her name rose and fell across the fields like a desperate prayer. Clara. Clara. Detective Mara Ellison was 3 cups of coffee deep and halfway through a headache when she pulled her unmarked sedan onto the main road. She had been with the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department for 12 years, long enough to know that most Amber Alerts ended in heartbreak. But something in the pit of her stomach told her this one was different. In the back seat, her partner sat perfectly still. Kaiser, a 5-year-old German shepherd, his dark coat gleaming even under the dim morning light. He wasn't like other dogs. Mara often joked he was born with his ears already standing at attention. His breathing was steady, eyes fixed on the blur of trees outside the window. When Clara's alert had gone out, Kaiser's posture had shifted instantly, as though he could smell the urgency woven into every word of the message. Mara rubbed her temple as she drove. She had known too many mornings like this. The empty shoes left by a back door, the photographs parents pressed into her hands, the hollow look in their eyes when they realized their child was truly gone. Her cynicism was armor, but it never truly held. Not when a child was 7 years old and wearing a unicorn hoodie. At headquarters, chaos hummed. Radios crackled with overlapping reports, printers spat out maps, and officers moved in hurried bursts. Clara's face, wide brown eyes, gap-toothed smile, was already taped to every wall. Mara signed herself in and clipped Kaiser's leash with muscle memory, her body weary, her mind sharpening by force of habit. "Ellison," the sheriff called out, waving her over. His face was pale, his voice taut. "We've got volunteers sweeping the east side, deputies on the river path, state police on the highway. Nothing yet." Mara nodded, though her eyes were already searching the room. She saw Clara's mother in the corner, hunched in a plastic chair. Shelby Jennings looked like someone whose soul had been torn from her body and left raw. Her hands shook violently as she tried to sign a statement, the pen slipping again and again. Mara crouched beside her. "Mrs. Jennings," she said softly, "I'm Detective Ellison. I need you to tell me everything you remember. Anything could help." Shelby's eyes lifted, red, swollen, wide with disbelief. "She left at 7:30, she whispered. "She always takes the same route. She waved goodbye. She waved." Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs. Mara let the silence stretch, the only sound the rhythmic scratching of Kaiser's claws against the tile as he shifted closer. Through trembling breaths, Shelby forced herself to continue. She was wearing that pink hoodie, the one with the unicorn. It's got silver thread in the horn. She loved it. She said it made her feel safe. She pressed her fist against her chest, sobbing harder now. "And I told her I'd meet her at school for the bake sale. How could she just vanish?" Mara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, anything, that might ease the weight crushing the woman in front of her. But there were no right words, only action. She reached out, resting a steadying hand on Shelby's shoulder. "We're going to find her," Mara said firmly, though the conviction came more from Kaiser's unyielding stance than from her own heart. At that moment, Kaiser rose to his full height, ears pointed, tail stiff. He wasn't reacting to Shelby's sobs. He was reacting to something else, something in the air, a signal Mara couldn't yet decipher. She felt the leash pull, taut as a wire, and realized once again that when the world turned chaotic, it was Kaiser who knew where to begin. Outside, the streets of Willow Creek echoed with the restless sound of boots on pavement, the tearing of tape as posters were slapped to telephone poles, the hiss of radios, sending voices into the static. The entire town seemed to breathe in one rhythm, bound together by dread and determination. But in the silence that followed Shelby's breakdown, Mara understood something crucial. This wasn't just another Amber Alert. It wasn't just another case, because when Clara's name went out into the world, Kaiser had already shifted, already bristled. He knew, and Mara had learned the hard way, never to ignore him. Somewhere out there, Clara Jennings was still alive, and Kaiser intended to find her. By late morning, Willow Creek had turned into a search grid. Maps spread across the hoods of squad cars, radios chattered in clipped bursts, and the sidewalks filled with neighbors carrying flashlights they didn't need yet. Children's bikes leaned abandoned against chain-link fences, the laughter that usually filled the neighborhood replaced by voices calling Clara's name into the wind. They started with the obvious places. The schoolyard was swept first, beneath the jungle gym, behind the cafeteria dumpsters, even the crawl space under the modular classrooms. Empty. From there, the lines of volunteers fanned out toward the soccer fields, their boots trampling through wet grass and leaving muddy trails behind. Every culvert was checked, flashlights sending thin beams into damp tunnels. Nothing. Mara Ellison moved through it all with a careful eye, her badge clipped to her belt, her coat drawn tight against the rising wind. She had done this before, too many times. She knew how quickly the hope drained from people's faces when hours stretched without results. At first, voices rang out strong. "Clara! Clara! Sweetheart!" But as the sun pushed higher and the town realized just how small a child could be against so much land, the shouts began to falter. Everywhere Mara looked, she saw fragments of desperation. A man on his knees, peering under parked cars. A mother rattling the latch of a shed, as if Clara might answer from inside. Teenagers climbing fences into backyards that weren't theirs. And still, no sign. Kaiser moved beside her, tethered by the leash but pulling gently, nose working, ears twitching. He paused at every corner, scanning, always alert. Mara trusted his instincts more than her own. But even he seemed unsettled today, drawn in one direction, then another, circling back as if the air itself carried too many false trails. "Ellison," a deputy called, jogging toward her with mud up to his shins. "We've got nothing at the creek bed, just beer bottles and a shopping cart. No footprints." Mara nodded, jaw tight. She'd expected as much. "Keep moving north," she said. "Pair with the fire team. Check the culverts again." The deputy nodded, heading off, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of futility. Mara slowed, letting the others fan out ahead. She needed a moment, away from the swarm of voices and radios, to collect her thoughts. She remembered other mornings, other names. A boy named Aidan, who had vanished from his backyard birthday party. Found 2 counties over, too late. A teenager named Riley, whose sneakers were discovered at the river bend, but never her. Every case carved a notch in Mara's memory, each one a reminder of what it meant to be too late. Her hand brushed against Kaiser's collar, grounding herself. He glanced up at her, dark eyes steady, then tugged forward. They passed the playground, swings still rocking faintly from the earlier sweep. A stuffed rabbit lay abandoned in the mulch, damp from morning dew. Mara bent down, picking it up. It wasn't Clara's. Shelby had confirmed Clara never carried toys to school. Still, Mara's fingers lingered on the worn fur. Objects had weight in cases like this. They carried the presence of children, even when the children were gone. She set it carefully on the bench, unwilling to leave it in the dirt. The hours dragged, noon came and went. The search expanded outward, through fields of tall grass, past drainage ditches clogged with leaves, across the lot of a half-abandoned strip mall where weeds pushed up through broken asphalt. The sun climbed, shadows shortened, and exhaustion began to set in. One by one, volunteers paused to catch their breath, to wipe sweat from their foreheads, to look at one another with eyes that asked the question no one wanted to voice. What if she isn't here at all? Mara checked her watch. Every passing hour narrowed the window. She glanced at Kaiser, who had stopped mid-step. His nose pressed low to the ground, then lifted sharply. His ears pivoted toward the east, his body stiffening. "What is it, boy?" Mara murmured. Kaiser pulled hard, tugging her toward an older part of town where the streets narrowed and sidewalks crumbled. The volunteers weren't searching here yet. It wasn't on the grid. Abandoned houses sat shoulder to shoulder, their shutters broken, their porches sagging. Most had been empty for years, casualties of the fire a decade earlier that had scarred the neighborhood. Mara hesitated. It wasn't protocol to break from the pattern. But Kaiser wasn't a dog prone to whims. When he fixed himself on a direction, there was always a reason. She followed him down a narrow street where weeds burst through cracked pavement. The place smelled of smoke that had long since faded but never quite left. Kaiser's nails clicked against the concrete, his body low, tail rigid. Halfway down the block he stopped. His head turned toward a cul-de-sac, silent and forgotten, framed by crooked street lamps that no longer lit. At the end of it loomed a house Mara had seen before only in photographs. The infamous Ashford house, blackened attic windows, roofline jagged like broken teeth. Even from this distance, it radiated a heaviness that pressed against her chest. Kaiser growled low in his throat, ears pinned. His muscles quivered, ready but restrained by the leash. Mara's grip tightened automatically. She swallowed hard, eyes on the house. 10 years ago, a fire had gutted the attic. A man had vanished in its flames, his family's name scorched into town legend. Since then, no one had moved in. Kids dared each other to step onto the porch, but adults stayed away, content to let rot swallow it whole. And yet here Kaiser stood, body tense, gaze locked, as if the house itself were breathing. Mara shook her head, forcing herself to look away. "Not yet," she whispered. The grid search still stretched across town. She couldn't justify following a hunch into a condemned property. Not yet. But as she turned back toward the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that Kaiser had been the only one, out of hundreds of eyes searching, to notice the shadow waiting at the edge of town. For now, she tugged him gently, leading him back toward the volunteers. But Kaiser resisted, glancing back at Ashford House with every step, his growl fading into silence, but never fully gone. Mara's gut twisted. She had learned long ago that when her partner sensed something, it wasn't chance, it was warning. And though the search would continue across fields and culverts, she knew with bone-deep certainty that the true trail had already begun, and it was leading them straight toward that forgotten house. The cul-de-sac at the far end of Willow Creek was a place most people avoided without needing to be told. It was silent there, too silent, as if the rest of the town's noise stopped at its threshold. Even the wind seemed to die before it reached the crooked street lamps that leaned like weary sentries along the road. Mara Ellison slowed her steps, boots crunching on gravel. Kaiser walked ahead, pulling with unusual determination, his nose twitching, ears pinned. His body language said what words couldn't. "This is where you should be looking." At the center of the cul-de-sac, Ashford House stood like a wound in the neighborhood. Once, it might have been a proud Victorian, painted cream with green shutters. Now, 10 years after the fire that gutted its attic, it was a carcass of splintered wood and charred beams. Paint peeled from the siding in strips, the porch sagged under its own weight, and the windows had been boarded up in mismatched plywood. Heavy chains bound the front door shut, links thick with rust. Above it all, the burned attic loomed. Black scars still visible along the roofline, the chimney leaning at a strange angle, cracked, but somehow unbroken. It was as though the house had been left to rot deliberately, not just abandoned, but punished. Kaiser stopped at the curb, stiff and alert. His growl rumbled low, a vibration that traveled up the leash into Mara's hand. She tightened her grip unconsciously, scanning the house. "Easy," she muttered, though her own chest was tight. "It's just a ruin." But the truth was, Ashford House had never been just anything. Everyone in Willow Creek knew its story. 10 years ago, in the autumn of 2014, the attic caught fire. The flames were strange. Neighbors swore they saw them flicker blue, heard something like children crying in the smoke. The owner, Louis Lindell, disappeared that night. Some said he perished in the blaze, body reduced to ash. Others whispered that he fled into the woods, burned but alive. Rumors clung to the house long after the fire crews left. Teenagers dared each other to climb onto the porch. One boy claimed he'd seen a shadow move in the attic window long after it had been declared uninhabitable. Another swore he'd heard music, like a lullaby, from inside the chimney. Most adults dismissed it as campfire tales, but still, no one bought the property. No one even tried. It sat, chained and condemned, a scar that wouldn't heal. And now, Kaiser was growling at it. Mara's instincts screamed to pull him back. The search grid was still wide. Volunteers spread across fields and culverts. She had no right, no warrant, no backup to enter a condemned house based on a dog's unease. Her training told her to ignore it, to stick to protocol. But her gut told her something else. She knelt beside Kaiser, steadying his thick fur under her palm. His muscles trembled, not in fear, but in readiness. His eyes locked on the chimney, unblinking. Mara knew him well enough to understand. This wasn't a false alert. Kaiser wasn't a dog to bark at shadows. "Why here?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Why now?" The leash pulled taut again, Kaiser lunging a few steps forward before stopping at the edge of the overgrown yard. Dead leaves crunched beneath his paws, scattering across the cracked walkway. He glanced back at Mara once, almost expectant, before returning his gaze to the house. Her mind flickered with memory. Clara Jennings's mother, sobbing in a plastic chair, describing her daughter's pink unicorn hoodie. The sound of her voice breaking. The empty chair at the school desk. And Kaiser's body, shifting the moment Clara's name hit the airwaves. Something connected, invisible but undeniable. Still, Mara hesitated. "Not yet," she told him firmly, tugging the leash. But Kaiser planted his paws, refusing to move. His growl deepened, not loud but steady, vibrating like a warning. The street around them was deserted, but Mara felt watched. Curtains in the nearby houses were drawn, blinds shut tight. The whole cul-de-sac had the feeling of a place abandoned not just by people, but by light itself. A creak broke the silence. Mara froze. The sound had come from the Ashford house porch, a long, slow complaint of rotting wood. The chains on the front door clinked faintly as if moved by unseen hands. She forced herself to breathe, probably the wind, and yet the air was still. Kaiser barked once, sharp and commanding. His ears pinned back, his body angled forward. He wanted in. Mara's radio crackled at her hip, jolting her. "Ellison, report," came the sheriff's voice. "Anything on your end?" She pressed the button, eyes still locked on the house. "Negative," she said evenly, still searching perimeter. She didn't mention the house, didn't mention Kaiser's growl. Not yet. She wasn't ready to explain why she felt her dog knew more than the grid itself. Releasing the button, she whispered, "We'll come back. I promise." Kaiser whined low, not in surrender, but in protest. His gaze never left the chimney, as if he could see something within the brickwork that her human eyes couldn't. Mara gave the leash a firm tug, and this time he relented, though every step away felt reluctant. He glanced back at Ashford House again and again, until the cul-de-sac was out of sight. Mara didn't look back. She couldn't, because she already knew what she'd see. The burned attic, the chained door, the leaning chimney, and the undeniable weight of a house that wasn't finished telling its story. The second time Kaiser pulled Mara toward Ashford House, there was no mistaking it. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't curious. He was locked in. His body moved like an arrow loose from a bow, nose cutting through the air, muscles taut with certainty. Mara had been trying to guide him back to the main road, to return to the official search grid. But Kaiser resisted, paws dragging against the leash, until finally he lunged forward, almost wrenching it from her hand. "Kaiser," Mara hissed, breath clouding in the cold morning air. "Enough." But he didn't listen. He bolted across the yard, leaves scattering beneath him, claws scraping against cracked concrete. He leapt the sagging steps of the back deck in a single bound. Mara swore under her breath, jogging after him, her boots crunching on the brittle leaves. The house loomed closer with every step, its windows blind, its boards groaning. Even in daylight, it radiated something wrong, a silence that pressed against her skin. "Kaiser, get down," she snapped. But he was already moving higher, claws scraping against the slanted sheet of aluminum that covered part of the roof. His body stretched low, tail stiff, every nerve tuned to something unseen. He reached the chimney in seconds. The cracked brick rose crookedly against the grey sky, like a jagged finger pointing upward. Kaiser circled it, his paws steady even on the unstable roof. His growl was low, vibrating, almost like language. Mara's chest tightened. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She hated heights, hated even more the thought of her partner slipping through rotten shingles. But what chilled her wasn't the danger. It was the focus in Kaiser's eyes. This wasn't random. She forced her voice to calm, though it wavered. "Kaiser, come down." But Kaiser didn't budge. He pressed his nose against the rusted metal crown, sniffing, then pulled back with a sharp bark that echoed against the empty street. It wasn't a call of fear. It was a demand. "Look here." Mara's stomach twisted. She remembered the stories whispered about Ashford House, how children claimed to see faces in its windows, even after the fire, how teenagers dared each other to step onto the porch, only to run shrieking at the sound of faint laughter inside. Adults dismissed it all as urban legend, the way people did when truth brushed too close to nightmare. But standing there, watching her canine partner circle that chimney like it was the center of the earth, Mara didn't feel like laughing. The air smelled faintly of char, though the fire had burned out a decade ago. She could almost hear the echoes herself, thin, ghostly threads of children's voices just out of reach. Her radio crackled at her hip, snapping her back. "Ellison, report." She pressed the button, eyes still on Kaiser. No sign yet. Continuing search. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly. She didn't mention the house. She didn't mention the chimney. Not yet. Kaiser barked again, louder this time, his body rigid, ears forward. The sound made her heart jump. Mara climbed onto the bottom step of the deck, her boots pressing into rotted wood that groaned beneath her weight. "Kaiser," she said, softer now, almost pleading. "Come down. You're going to hurt yourself." But he ignored her. He stood at the chimney's edge, chest heaving, eyes sharp. Then he did something that unsettled her even more. He sat, not relaxed, not at ease. He sat like a soldier holding position, body forward, tail still, gaze locked. It was the posture he took when he'd found something alive. Mara's breath caught. She stared up at him, then at the chimney, then at the sagging roofline blackened from the fire years ago. She felt her throat tighten with something she couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or the awful, creeping certainty that Kaiser was right. Her mind flickered back to Clara's mother, her sobs in the station, her desperate words. She was wearing that pink hoodie. She said it made her feel safe. Mara swallowed hard. She had promised the woman she'd bring her daughter home, and now her dog was telling her the answer was here, in the most unlikely, impossible place. The house groaned around her, wood snapping faintly in the cold. A crow perched on the chimney's edge, wings shuddering as if in agreement with Kaiser's vigil. Mara stepped back, dragging her hand across her mouth. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself it was nothing but an old house and a dog's nerves. But deep down, she knew better. Kaiser never lied. And though she didn't know it yet, the chimney he circled was not just a ruin. It was a prison. The fire ladder rattled as the truck pulled into the cul-de-sac, its red lights casting an eerie glow against the ruined face of Ashford House. Neighbors who had followed the search stopped at the end of the block, their whispers rippling like leaves in the wind. No one dared step closer. The place had always carried a reputation, and now, with sirens wailing against its boarded windows, the dread felt justified. Mara Ellison kept her hand firm on Kaiser's leash, though the dog strained forward, eyes never leaving the chimney. His growls had grown sharper, urgent, the kind he only used when life, not contraband, not evidence, but life, was close. "Ellison," one of the firefighters called, adjusting his helmet as he studied the leaning chimney. "What are we doing here? This place is condemned." "Just get me a ladder," Mara said. Her tone left no room for debate. The firefighter hesitated, but gave the order. Within minutes, the ladder extended toward the sagging roof. Mara's boots slipped slightly as she mounted the first rungs, but her grip was steady. She wasn't about to let hesitation cost her the seconds that might mean everything. Kaiser barked once, sharp, demanding, as if to hurry her. At the top, the air felt colder, sharper. The chimney stood only a few feet away, cracked bricks laced with soot, the metal crown rusting in streaks. Up close, it looked like any other chimney, broken, abandoned, nothing more. But when Mara pressed her palm against the brick, she froze. It was warm, not faintly, not like sunlight had touched it hours ago, but warm as though a fire burned inside. Impossible. There was no gas line, no working fireplace, no reason for heat, yet the brick pulsed with unnatural warmth beneath her hand. "What the hell?" one of the firefighters muttered behind her. He placed his own gloved palm against the surface, then jerked back. "This shouldn't be hot. The house has no utilities." Mara ignored him, leaning closer. Kaiser's bark rose again from below, echoing up the ladder until it seemed to vibrate inside the chimney itself. And then she heard it. At first, it was faint, a thin, scraping sound, like nails dragging lightly against stone. She held her breath, listening harder. The sound came again, irregular, weak, like something small moving inside. "Shine the light down," Mara ordered. A firefighter angled a flashlight into the flue. The beam illuminated only dust and darkness, particles swirling like ash in the air. Nothing moved, nothing human, at least. Mara leaned further, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing oddly against the brick. "Is anyone in there?" Silence. Only the sound of her own breath inside her ears. For a moment, dread pooled heavy in her stomach. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe nothing at all. Then, so soft she almost thought she imagined it, a whimper. Mara's breath caught, her throat tightening so hard she nearly lost her balance on the ladder. She pressed closer, voice trembling despite her effort to hold steady. "Clara, sweetheart, can you hear me? My name is Mara. I'm here to help." Another sound drifted up. a muffled sob, fragile and thin, but undeniably human. "Jesus Christ," a firefighter whispered. "There's someone in there." Mara's hand gripped the brick until her knuckles ached. Emotion crashed into her. Relief, terror, disbelief all at once. She had prepared herself for the worst, had seen too many empty searches, too many names that ended only in memorials. But here, against all logic, against every probability, there was a child alive inside the chimney. She forced her voice steady, though tears stung her eyes. "Clara, stay very still. We're going to get you out, I promise. You're not alone anymore." Below, Kaiser barked again, not frantic, but resolute, as if answering the child's cry himself. The sound carried strength, assurance. Mara closed her eyes for a second, letting it ground her. When she opened them, her focus was sharpened. She turned to the firefighters. "Get your thermal scope. I want eyes inside that flue. Now." They scrambled into action. Within minutes, a small camera, attached to a thermal sensor, was lowered into the chimney. The monitor flickered with static. Then shapes emerged, irregular, bright against the dark. A curled figure, tiny arms trembling, a head tucked against knees, heat signature, alive. "There," Mara whispered, pointing. "That's her." The firefighters exchanged glances, their skepticism dissolving into grim determination. "It'll take time," one said. "We'll have to pull the crown off brick by brick. If we're not careful, the whole thing could collapse." "Then take your time," Mara snapped, her voice sharp with urgency. "But move. She doesn't have long." The team set to work, crowbars prying, chisels striking. Each sound rang like thunder against the stillness of the cul-de-sac. Dust and soot spilled down the roof, coating Mara's gloves. As the firefighters worked, Mara stayed close to the opening, her voice steady, calling into the dark. "Clara, can you hear me? I need you to keep talking to me. Anything you can say." There was a cough, ragged and wet. Then a whisper, fragile as smoke. "Mommy?" Mara's chest broke. For a moment, her vision blurred. She had to swallow twice before she could answer. "Your mom is waiting for you, Clara. She's waiting. But we need you to stay still, so we can bring you to her." The scraping came again, faint movements as the girl shifted. Mara forced herself to breathe evenly. She couldn't afford to let her emotions drown her. Not now. Behind her, the firefighters grunted with effort, prying free another slab of rusted metal. The chimney groaned but held. Piece by piece, the impossible rescue had begun. Mara stayed rooted to the spot, her hand still pressed against the brick. She whispered again, voice breaking despite herself. "Hold on, sweetheart. Just hold on." And for the first time in hours, for the first time since her desk sat empty at school, there was hope. The sound of brick giving way was sharp and final, a crack echoing through the cul-de-sac like the snap of bone. Soot billowed into the cold air, drifting in black clouds across the roof. The firefighters worked with quiet urgency now, every motion precise, every tool strike deliberate. This was no longer a search, it was a surgery. Mara crouched near the chimney opening, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had one glove pressed against the warm brick, her other hand gripping the edge of the ladder. The thermal monitor still showed the small figure curled deep inside, but the image wavered each time dust clouded the lens. "Almost there," one of the firefighters muttered, his voice strained. His face was streaked with sweat beneath his helmet, though the autumn air bit cold. "Hold steady." Mara leaned closer, lowering her voice to the opening. "Clara, sweetheart, Can you hear me? We're almost to you. Don't be scared. There was a faint rustle, a cough, then silence. For one dreadful moment, Mara thought the girl had gone still. Then just barely, a whimper. It was enough to keep everyone moving. Piece by piece, the crown of the chimney was loosened. Soot rained down their arms, staining gloves, stinging eyes. The bricks fought to hold, as though the house itself didn't want to release what it had taken. When the final slab came loose, the firefighters lowered a narrow rescue harness into the flue. The rope hissed as it descended. "It's tight," one of them said. "We'll have to ease her out slow." Mara's throat ached. She forced her voice calm. "Clara, I need you to reach for the strap, honey. Just reach. We'll pull you up." At first, nothing. Then, the faintest scrape, movement. The harness jerked once, then steadied. "Got her," the firefighter whispered. They began to haul slowly, carefully. Inch by inch, the small frame emerged, coated in black dust. Soot clung to Clara's hair, her eyelashes, her skin, her hoodie. The pink unicorn her mother had described with shaking hands was almost unrecognizable, the bright color smothered under ash. When her head finally surfaced from the flue, Mara's breath left her in a shudder. Clara's eyes were squeezed shut, her cheeks streaked gray, her lips trembling. Her small hands clutched something so tightly to her chest, Mara thought at first it was a scrap of brick. Then the soot cleared, and she saw it. A music box, tarnished metal glinting faintly beneath the grime. The firefighters eased her free at last, lowering her carefully onto the roof, where Mara knelt waiting. For a second, Clara didn't move, curled in on herself, as though the chimney still held her captive. Mara pulled off her gloves and reached out, her hand gentle against the girl's back. "It's okay. You're safe now. We've got you." Clara's eyes fluttered open, wide and glassy. She looked at Mara, as though trying to decide if she was real. Then she turned her head slightly, lips parting. A single word slipped out, whispered so faint it was almost lost to the wind. "Monster." Mara froze. The word cut through her like ice water. Her breath caught, chest tightening with the weight of it. She had expected cries for her mother, sobs of fear, maybe silence from shock. But this was different. A declaration, not of what she'd escaped, but of what still lingered. Clara clutched the music box tighter, her small fingers trembling. Mara brushed a strand of soot-clumped hair from her forehead, but her own hands shook. Something about that word, spoken in a rasp that no child should know, lodged in her bones. Below, Kaiser barked once, sharp and commanding, then scrambled onto the deck stairs. His claws scraped against the sagging wood as he pulled himself higher, muscles straining. By the time Mara shifted Clara into her arms, Kaiser had reached the porch, then leapt onto the roof with a grace that defied his size. He padded straight to Clara, nose twitching, tail stiff. He lowered his head slowly, gently pressing his forehead against her tiny chest. Clara gasped softly, but didn't recoil. Her trembling eased by a fraction, her small hand resting weakly against his ear. Mara swallowed hard. She had worked with Kaiser for years, trusted him in alleys, in raids, in fields of gunsmoke and fear. But she had never seen him move like this. Gentle, deliberate, as though he understood the fragility of the child before him. The firefighters busied themselves with ropes and equipment. But for a moment, Mara's world narrowed to the girl, the dog, and the word still echoing in her ears. Monster. This wasn't a routine rescue. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off and hiding in an old ruin. Someone had put her here, Someone had sealed her into a place no one would think to look. And if Clara was whispering about monsters, then she had seen something Mara wasn't sure she wanted to imagine. She adjusted her grip on the child, rising carefully to her feet. Clara weighed almost nothing, her frame thin, her breaths shallow against Mara's collar. Kaiser stayed close, his body brushing against Mara's leg as though guarding them both. Mara looked down from the roof at the gathering crowd. Officers waited with stretchers. Neighbors clutched their mouths, their eyes wide. The air was thick with disbelief. But Mara wasn't watching them. She was staring back at the chimney, still standing despite the pieces they had torn away. The heat still radiated faintly from its brick, impossible and wrong. She tightened her hold on Clara, whispering into the girl's soot-streaked hair. "You're safe now. I swear it." But inside she wasn't sure. Because as Kaiser's growl rumbled low and steady beside her, Mara knew one thing with absolute certainty. Clara Jennings's disappearance was no accident. This was only the beginning. The hospital room was too bright for a child who had come out of darkness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bleaching the walls in a sterile glow. Machines blinked softly, monitors tracing the fragile rhythm of a 7-year-old heartbeat. Outside, footsteps echoed down linoleum halls, but inside room 217, the world seemed to shrink to a fragile stillness. Clara Jennings sat propped against a stack of pillows, her small frame swallowed by hospital sheets. The unicorn hoodie had been taken away, folded into an evidence bag, but soot still clung stubbornly to the edges of her fingernails. She hadn't let go of the music box since the moment she was freed. Its brass edges were blackened with ash, its latch half broken, but she held it as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. Her fingers traced the grooves absently, winding it just enough for a faint, tinny melody to spill out. The sound was uneven, the gears strained from years of wear, but the lullaby filled the room with a haunting sweetness. It was a song meant to soothe, yet in this place, it felt like a ghost. Mara Ellison stood by the foot of the bed, her coat draped over a chair, her badge tucked into her pocket. She had done this before, sat beside children who had survived things no child should endure. But there was something different about Clara, something that unsettled Mara more deeply than she wanted to admit. Kaiser lay curled on the floor beside the bed, his dark coat blending with the shadows. His ears twitched at every sound, but his eyes remained on Clara. He had been allowed inside only because Mara insisted, and now he kept his silent vigil, the steady thump of his breathing grounding the fragile quiet. By the window stood Shelby Jennings, Clara's mother, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though holding her body together by force. She hadn't spoken much since arriving. Words seemed too fragile to carry the weight of what had nearly been lost. Now she simply watched, her reflection caught in the glass, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Mara cleared her throat softly, crouching to bring herself level with Clara's gaze. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "can you tell me what happened? Anything you remember will help us make sure this never happens again." Clara's eyes flicked to her, then down to the music box. She wound it once more, the gears squealing faintly. The lullaby played a single verse before faltering. "I heard them," Clara whispered. Her voice was rasped thin, a raw scrape of sound that made Shelby press a fist against her mouth. Mara leaned closer, keeping her tone steady. "You heard who, Clara?" Clara's grip tightened on the music box. "The others. They were singing." The words hung in the air like a draft, chilling even in the warm hospital room. Mara's brows drew together. Others? Clara nodded slowly, her eyes wide and glassy. In the walls, when it was dark, I heard them. Girls. They sang songs, so I wouldn't be scared. They told me not to move. Shelby gasped softly, turning toward the window, her shoulders shaking. Mara felt her own throat constrict. She had read files, seen the trinkets in the crawl space, the names etched on shelves. Sierra, Rosie, Anna. Now, Clara sat here, alive, whispering about voices that matched the dead. Clara, Mara said carefully, her voice almost breaking. Did you see these girls, or just hear them? Clara shook her head, her hair brushing the pillow. Only the singing, sometimes whispers. They said to stay still, or he would get mad. Mara's pulse jumped. Who would get mad? The girl's hand trembled against the music box. Her voice was barely audible, a ghost of a word. The burned man. Shelby let out a low sob, muffled into her sleeve. Mara closed her eyes briefly, drawing a breath, forcing her own fear into a corner where it wouldn't spill. She reached out, brushing Clara's small hand with her own. It's okay, Mara murmured. You're safe now. He can't hurt you. But Clara shook her head, her eyes darting toward the ceiling, as if listening to something only she could hear. Her voice was a whisper, carried on tremors. He told me the fire would come if I moved, so I stayed. I stayed really still. Kaiser stirred, lifting his head. A low whine escaped him, ears twitching toward Clara, as if he understood every word. He rose, placing his chin gently on the edge of her bed, his warm breath brushing her arm. Clara reached for him instinctively, fingers tangling in his fur. The monitor beside her bed beeped steady, but Mara felt as though the room itself was unraveling. She could handle suspects, evidence, courtrooms. But this, a child whispering about phantom songs and a man with a burned face. This felt like stepping into something older, darker, and far less rational. Mara rose slowly, her legs stiff, and turned toward Shelby. The woman's face was wet with tears, her lips trembling with words that refused to come. Mrs. Jennings, Mara said softly. We'll do everything we can to protect her. I promise. Shelby nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on her daughter, the tears unbroken. The music box clicked in Clara's hands, playing one last fractured note before falling silent. She pressed it against her chest, whispering once more, as if to herself. The others were waiting for me. Mara felt her stomach hollow. She glanced at Kaiser, who hadn't moved, his gaze fixed and unyielding. He was listening too, and Mara realized with a sinking weight that Clara Jennings' nightmare wasn't just a child's trauma. It was testimony. The precinct was quiet after midnight, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and reminded Mara Ellison that police stations, no matter how bright the fluorescent lights, were still haunted places. Most of the deputies had gone home, their energy spent on the search, their voices worn thin from shouting Clara's name across fields and culverts. But Mara couldn't sleep. She never could. Not after cases like this. The adrenaline burned too hot. The questions clawed too deep. So she sat alone in the records room, a desk lamp casting its circle of yellow light across stacks of files that smelled of smoke, mold, and years too long forgotten. Kaiser lay at her feet, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, though his ears twitched at every creak of the building. Even in rest, he was alert, restless. Mara envied that clarity. Her own head was a tangle. Clara Jennings was alive. By miracle, by luck, or by something darker. But Clara's whispers still echoed in her mind. The other children were singing. The Burned Man. Mara pulled the folder closer, its edges frayed. Stamped across the top, Ashford House, Fire Incident 2014. She flipped it open, her pen tapping absently against the desk. The official report was brief, almost insultingly so. Structural fire originating in attic. Cause undetermined. Owner, Louis Lindell. Status, missing, presumed dead. No body ever recovered. No mention of children, though neighbors had filed calls that night about screams in the smoke. She turned the page. A stack of complaint reports followed, filed years before the fire. Noise disturbances. Unregistered minors suspected on property. Anonymous calls about children seen at windows. Thin faces pressed against the glass. Every complaint had been investigated. Everyone closed with the same note. No evidence found. Mara's jaw tightened. She knew that phrase well. No evidence found was bureaucratic code for "we didn't look hard enough." She scribbled in her notebook. Foster children, unconfirmed. Next came a list of agencies tied loosely to the Lindell name. Foster placements, temporary housing, emergency care. Most of the paperwork was vague, the kind of half-finished forms that slipped through cracks. Names blacked out, case numbers that led nowhere. But one sheet caught her attention. It was dated October 2005. A line item, nearly illegible, referenced a child placed temporarily with the Lindells. No follow-up. No exit report. Just a first name, scrawled in faint ink. Sierra. Mara froze. Her breath caught, as though the word itself had claws. She flipped open her notebook, where she'd jotted Clara's hospital statement. Clara had clutched her music box, soot-stained and broken, whispering about voices in the walls. Mara had examined the box herself earlier that day. Inside the lid, scratched faintly into the brass, was a single engraving. Sierra, 2005. The pieces slid together with terrifying ease. Mara leaned back, her chair creaking. She stared at the name until the letters blurred. This wasn't coincidence. Clara had been found holding something that belonged to a girl who vanished 20 years earlier. Her pen scratched furiously across the page. Sierra Dempsey, age 6, missing 2005. Case cold. No remains found. And last seen. Backyard, 7 blocks from Ashford House. She had seen the file before, an unsolved case buried in the archives, one of many that had kept her awake at night. Now Sierra's name was resurfacing, carried into the present through a child's trembling hands and a haunted lullaby. Mara exhaled shakily, pressing her palms against her temples. The implications were staggering. If Sierra had been tied to Ashford House, if her music box had stayed inside its walls for 2 decades, then the fire hadn't cleansed anything. It had only concealed. Her gaze slid to Kaiser. The dog lifted his head, ears flicking, eyes dark and steady. He didn't need to understand words to know the weight of her silence. Mara reached down, brushing her fingers across the ridge of his back. "We're not just dealing with a missing child," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "This house, it's been holding secrets for years." She pulled another file, dust falling in grey streaks. It contained foster records flagged by the county. Many were incomplete, names crossed out or missing, but patterns emerged the longer she stared. Children disappeared near Ashford House more often than anywhere else in Willow Creek. Girls, mostly, ages 5 to 10. The gaps in reporting weren't accidents, they were erasures. Her stomach turned. She had dealt with predators before, but this felt different. This wasn't one broken man making choices in the dark. This felt deliberate, systematic. She circled Sierra's name again, the ink carving deep grooves into the paper. The lullaby from the music box echoed in her mind. Clara had said the other children sang to her, told her not to move, not to make him angry. Clara hadn't been imagining ghosts. She'd been remembering something older, something left behind. A shadow stretched across the records room window, and Mara's head snapped up. For a moment she thought she saw movement outside, a figure shifting past the glass. She stood quickly, hand on her holster, but when she pulled the blinds, the lot was empty, lit only by the orange glow of a flickering street lamp. Her chest tightened. She wasn't imagining things. Not tonight. When she sat back down, Kaiser had risen to his feet, body tense, his gaze fixed on the door. Mara exhaled slowly. "You feel it too," she murmured. He didn't move, but his growl was low, steady, vibrating through the floor. Mara gathered the files, stacking them neatly, though her hands shook. Sierra's name wasn't just a note in an old report anymore. It was a thread, leading them deeper into something Willow Creek had chosen to forget. And as she shut the folder, one thought burned hotter than the rest. Clara Jennings had survived the chimney. Sierra Dempsey had not. But through Clara's trembling hands and that broken music box, Sierra was still speaking. And Mara was finally listening. The night pressed heavy over Willow Creek, a damp kind of darkness that seemed to soak into the bones. Clouds moved slow across the moon, stretching shadows long across the cracked pavement. The cul-de-sac at Maple Hollow was deserted, silent except for the crunch of Mara Ellison's boots and the low, steady breathing of Kaiser at her side. Ashford House loomed at the end of the street, black against the sky. Its boarded windows looked like blind eyes, its porch sagged deeper than it had that morning, and its chimney leaned as though it carried more than brick within. In daylight, it had been unsettling. At night, it was unbearable. Yet here they were. Mara tightened her grip on the flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the weeds that choked the yard. Kaiser moved ahead, ears pricked, his body tense. He wasn't restless tonight. He was purposeful, every step deliberate. "You sure about this, boy?" Mara whispered, though she already knew the answer. He didn't glance back, didn't pause. He went straight for the side of the house, his nose pressed low to the ground. His nails scraped against warped siding, then against something hollow. Mara followed, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and char. The house groaned as the wind shifted, a sound too much like a breath. Kaiser stopped suddenly, his paw pressed against a section of paneling near the base of the wall. Then he scratched. Once, twice, then again, claws dragging against wood with sharp insistence. His growl rumbled low in his chest, vibrating through the still night. Mara crouched, running her hand across the spot. The wood felt different here, thinner, as if it had been added after the fact. She tapped it lightly. Hollow. Her stomach tightened. "What are you showing me?" She pulled a crowbar from her bag, wedging it under the panel. The wood resisted at first, nails screeching, then gave way with a crack that echoed too loud in the silence. The smell that wafted out was old dust and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. Mara raised her flashlight, angling it into the space. Her breath caught. Behind the panel stretched a narrow crawl space, lined from floor to ceiling with shelves. And on those shelves sat objects, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Trinkets of childhood, small enough to be forgotten by the world, but not by the ones who had once held them. A red ribbon, frayed at the edges. A pair of tiny sneakers, soles worn thin. A teddy bear, missing an eye. A row of hair clips, each dulled by dust. Each item was labeled. Small tags hung from string, handwritten in neat block letters. Sierra, 2005. Rosie, 2008. Anna, 2011. Mara's knees went weak. Her flashlight shook in her hand as the beam traced along the years, the names. Each tag marked another child lost, another life erased. And then, at the end of the row, a tag so new it hadn't yet gathered dust. The ink was sharp, black, unyielding. Clara, 2025. Mara's throat closed. She had to steady herself against the wall. The name of the girl who now lay in a hospital bed, clutching her music box, already claimed here, as if she had been nothing more than another trophy. Kaiser whined low, stepping closer to the opening. He didn't bark this time. He simply stared inside, his body rigid, as though he too understood the weight of what lay hidden here. Mara forced herself forward, ducking into the crawl space. Dust coated her hair, clung to her jacket, but she ignored it. She lifted the ribbon, the teddy bear, the sneaker, one by one. Each was fragile, brittle with time. But the names cut deepest. She knew them. She had read their case files. Sierra Dempsey, missing 2005. Rosie Arian, 2008. Anna Wells, 2011. All cold cases. All unanswered questions. And now she had the answer. Her chest burned. These weren't just forgotten children. They had been catalogued, preserved, as though their disappearances were part of something ritualistic, something methodical. Her flashlight beam caught on something at the very back of the shelf. A photograph, its edges curled with age. A group of children, smiling weakly, lined up in front of a summer camp building. Behind them, an adult woman, her face shadowed beneath a scarf. Mara's heart lurched, but she shoved it down. Not yet. Not tonight. She stepped back, pulling air into her lungs as though surfacing from deep water. This wasn't a house. It was a mausoleum. Mara turned to Kaiser, who waited at the entrance, his silhouette filling the crawl space. His eyes caught the beam of her flashlight, glowing amber in the dark. He didn't move, didn't blink. He was waiting. For her. For the decision she would have to make. Mara's hand trembled as she reached for her radio. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to press the button. Because once she did, once she reported this, there would be no going back. Willow Creek would never be the same. Finally, she raised it to her mouth. Her voice came out hoarse. "This is Detective Ellison. I need a forensic team at Ashford House immediately." She swallowed hard. "We've got evidence of multiple victims." Repeat, multiple. The words felt like stones in her mouth. When she clicked the radio off, the silence returned, heavier than before. Kaiser pressed his head briefly against her leg, grounding her. Mara exhaled, the sound shaking. She looked back at the crawl space one last time. The shelves sat in orderly rows, the names swinging gently in the draft, as though acknowledging her presence. Sierra, Rosie, Anna, Clara. And she knew, with a clarity that chilled her, that this wasn't the end of the list. It was only the beginning. By dawn, Willow Creek was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. The news had spread faster than the sirens ever could. The missing girl had been found alive. In the grocery store parking lot where volunteers had gathered, cheers broke out when word reached them. Neighbors hugged one another. Strangers clapped backs, the kind of relief that rolls like a wave after a sleepless night. But relief carried shadows. At the diner on Main Street, waitresses poured coffee into hands that shook, not just from exhaustion but from fear. Customers leaned across booths, whispering words that tasted sour. She said monster. She heard voices in the walls, the burned man's back. No one spoke loud enough for their children to hear, but kids are always listening. And by the time the bell above the door jingled again, even the littlest ones were asking if the monster lived in the chimney. The volunteers who had spent the night searching wore their pride like armor, telling themselves the community had saved Clara. Yet every story circled back to the same truth. They hadn't found her. A dog had, a German shepherd, pacing and growling at a house no one dared touch. That detail unsettled people more than it reassured them, because if Kaiser hadn't barked, Clara would still be inside. And what kind of place hides a child in its chimney? Mara Ellison felt the shift like a weight pressing against her shoulders as she stepped into the precinct that morning. The air was thick with voices, phones ringing off the hook, reporters already circling like hawks. A whiteboard in the lobby still held maps from the search, circles drawn in red where volunteers had scoured fields and culverts. Someone had scrawled across the top in permanent marker. Found. But beside the celebration, murmurs grew louder. Parents demanded answers. Was there someone prowling their streets? Was Clara taken by a man? Or had she stumbled into the ruin on her own, somehow surviving 2 days in the soot and dark? Mara knew the answer. She had seen the crawl space. She had read the names on the tags swinging from shelves. But she couldn't share that yet. Not until forensics finished their sweep. Not until the sheriff approved the release. And so the town clung to rumors. On the courthouse steps, a crowd gathered. Some lit candles, relief spilling into prayer vigils. Others carried signs demanding justice. One mother shouted into a reporter's microphone, her voice cracking, "If there's a monster in our town, we need to know who he is. Our children aren't safe." Kaiser stood at Mara's side through it all, his ears twitching, his eyes scanning every movement as though he expected someone to step forward, to claim the terror that now gripped Willow Creek. He was restless, unsettled. Mara could feel it in the tension of his leash. Inside the station, the divide grew sharper. Deputies argued in hushed tones near the break room. "It's superstition." The kid was delirious. "No, you didn't see her face. She believed it. Belief doesn't make monsters real." Mara stood in the doorway listening, her silence heavier than any argument, because she knew something worse than a ghost had left its mark on Clara. Something human. Something deliberate. That afternoon, Shelby Jennings was escorted into the press conference. She looked smaller than she had in the hospital. Her shoulders curved inward, her arms wrapped around Clara's unicorn hoodie, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Her voice trembled as she thanked the volunteers, the officers, the town. But when a reporter asked if Clara had said anything about what happened, Shelby faltered. Her eyes filled with tears. She shook her head once, then whispered into the microphone, She said there was a monster." The room fell into silence. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire. The word was out. By evening, the monster had taken on a dozen shapes. Some swore it was the ghost of Louis Lindell, the man who had disappeared in the attic fire. Others claimed a drifter was hiding in the house, preying on children. A few whispered darker theories, cults, rituals, fires that never went out. Parents pulled their children inside early, blinds snapped shut, porches dark. And through it all, Mara sat at her desk. Files spread like a deck of curses. Sierra's name circled in ink. Clara's music box beside her. The lullaby had wound down hours ago, but she could still hear it in her head. She looked at Kaiser, sprawled at her feet, but far from relaxed. His ears pricked toward the door, his body alert. He hadn't slept since Clara was pulled from the chimney. Neither had she. "This isn't just a ghost story," Mara whispered, more to herself than to him. "It's worse." Kaiser lifted his head, eyes catching the desk lamp, glowing like embers. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. Because Mara already knew the truth. The town was right to be uneasy. Clara had been found, yes, but the real predator was still out there, moving through their streets like smoke. The office of Mara Deacon was tucked away in the county's child services building, a squat brick structure that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Its hallways were narrow, lined with faded posters about safety, smiling children, and phone numbers. Most kids never dared to call. Mara Ellison had walked these halls before, chasing dead-end leads, filing requests that were met with shrugs. But tonight felt different. The chill from Ashford House still clung to her, and Clara's whisper about the monster echoed in her ears. She needed answers, and there was only one person in Willow Creek who might give them. Mara Deacon had been with Child Protective Services for over 30 years. Her hair was silver now, her shoulders stooped, but her eyes were sharp as pins. She'd seen more broken homes than anyone should in one lifetime, and her desk reflected it. Stacks of files, coffee cups gone cold, photographs of children whose stories had no neat endings. When Mara Ellison entered, Deacon barely looked up. "If you're here to tell me another kid slipped through the cracks, I don't need the reminder." Mara set Clara's music box on the desk with a soft thud. The metal gleamed faintly in the lamplight, still smudged with soot. "I'm here because of this," she said. Deacon's eyes narrowed. She reached for the box, her hands steady despite her age. She turned it over, read the faint engraving inside the lid. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Sierra, 2005. Deacon set it down slowly. "Where did you get this?" "Clara Jennings," Mara answered. 7 years old. We pulled her out of Ashford House's chimney 2 nights ago. She was clutching it like her life depended on it. Deacon leaned back, her chair creaking. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "Sierra Dempsey." Mara nodded. "I found her case file, missing since 2005. No remains, no suspects. But now her name turns up in Clara's hands, 20 years later." Deacon's sigh was heavy, weighted with years of guilt. "I remember Sierra. Sweet little girl. Freckles. Laughed with her whole body. She bounced between foster homes like a pinball. There was talk of neglect, abuse. Every time we tried to move her, the paperwork got tangled. And then, one day, she was gone." Mara leaned forward. "Do you remember where she was placed last?" Deacon hesitated, then opened a drawer. She pulled out an old manila folder, edges worn soft from handling. Inside were photocopied forms, grainy black and white photos, placement slips stamped with half-legible signatures. She slid one across the desk. Hearthlight Refuge. Mara's eyes narrowed. "Never heard of it." "Most people haven't," Deacon said grimly. It was a faith-based non-profit. Claimed they were all about second chances, temporary placements, emergency shelters. They took the kids no one else wanted, the hard cases, the ones caught in custody battles or pulled from meth houses at 2 in the morning. And they vanished. Deacon's voice cracked on the last word, but she pressed on. Not all of them, but enough. We'd send children there for 30 days, sometimes less. Then the paperwork would stop. No photos, no updates. When I called, they always had an excuse. Moved to a permanent home, transferred out of state, adopted by relatives. But when I tried to verify, the trail went cold. Mara felt her stomach tighten. How many kids? Deacon's eyes flicked to the stacks of files crowding her desk. Dozens. Maybe more. Most of their names are in my drawer. Sierra, Rosie, Anna. Kids we still list as missing. She swallowed, her voice breaking. I raised hell about it, detective. I filed complaints. No one listened. Hearthlight dissolved in 2015. Shut down quietly. No audit, no investigation. And the children? They stayed gone. Mara scribbled the name into her notebook, the ink pressing deep into the paper. Hearthlight Refuge. Dissolved, 2015. Her pulse raced. This was the thread she'd been searching for. It wasn't random children. It wasn't bad luck. It was systemic. Organized. She looked up at Deacon. Why 2015? The fire, Deacon said flatly. Mara stilled. Ashford House burned in October 2014, Deacon continued. The owner, Louis Lindell, was tied to Hearthlight on paper. Donations, property use, things hidden in tax filings. After the fire, the non-profit folded within months. Some of us suspected the two were connected. But she spread her hands, helpless. By then, nobody wanted to touch it. Too many scandals. Too many children already lost. Mara closed her eyes briefly, Sierra's name burning behind her lids. Clara's whispers returned. The others were waiting for me. The burned man. She opened her eyes again, sharp. I need those files. Every placement, every complaint, every name that ever crossed Hearthlight's books. Deacon studied her, the lines around her mouth deepening. If you open this, detective, you won't like what you find. Mara leaned forward, her voice low, steady. A little girl just survived 48 hours in a chimney with a dead girl's music box. I already don't like what I've found. The older woman held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, sliding the drawer open further, pulling file after file onto the desk. The names stacked higher, the years stretching back further than Mara wanted to admit. As she flipped through them, a sick pattern emerged. October. Again and again, children vanished in October. The weeks surrounding Halloween. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a ritual. Mara whispered the names aloud as she read, her voice barely audible. Sierra, Rosie, Anna, and now Clara. Beside her, Kaiser whined, shifting his weight. His ears twitched, his nose lifting slightly, as though even he could sense the ghosts carried in those papers. Mara Deacon's voice was quiet but firm. You see it now, don't you? Hearthlight wasn't saving children. It was delivering them. Mara shut the folder, her jaw tight. She felt the weight of the files pressing into her chest like stones. She knew, with a certainty that made her skin crawl, that Willow Creek hadn't been haunted by ghosts all these years. It had been hunted, and the hunt wasn't over. The conference room at Willow Creek Precinct was never meant to hold ghosts. Yet tonight it felt as though the walls themselves were bowing beneath their weight. The space smelled faintly of coffee gone stale and the dry tang of paper, but layered over it was something heavier. Grief thickened by years of neglect. Detective Mara Ellison stood at the corkboard, tacks clenched between her fingers. One by one, she pressed photographs into place until the board transformed into something between a memorial and an accusation. School portraits with forced smiles, birthday snapshots, cake smeared across cheeks, Halloween costumes, tiny witches, superheroes, princesses. 24 faces in total, each frozen in a moment when they still belong to the world. Above each picture, she scrawled the year in red marker. 2 decades stretched across the board. The timeline staggered, but unmistakable. 15 of those faces had no closure. No bodies recovered. No suspects charged. Just the cold silence of unsolved files. Mara stepped back, her chest tight. The board looked less like a collection of random tragedies and more like a design, a pattern too cruel to be coincidence. Kaiser paced behind her, nails clicking against the linoleum floor. He moved back and forth, restless in a way that made Mara's skin prickle. His ears twitched with each photo she pinned, his eyes following her movements like he understood the weight of what she was building. When he stopped, it was always in front of the board, his gaze fixed on the faces as if they might blink back at him. "You feel it too, don't you?" Mara murmured, not taking her eyes from the photographs. Kaiser let out a low growl, quiet but steady, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. It wasn't aggression. It was vigilance. The same sound he'd made at Ashford House, nose pressed to the chimney, when he refused to move until the truth revealed itself. Mara swallowed, her throat dry. She capped the red marker and let it fall onto the table. The clatter was loud in the empty room. She leaned against the edge of the table, rubbing her temples. She had studied patterns before. Gang turf wars, trafficking routes, even cult behavior. But this was different. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled. Every October, children between 5 and 10 years old vanished within a radius that always centered back on one place: Ashford House. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the board where Clara Jennings's photo now hung, the ink of 2025 still fresh beneath it. Next to her, she had pinned the evidence photo of the music box. The engraving glinted faintly under the fluorescent light. Sierra, 2005. 20 years apart. Same house, same pattern. Mara pressed a hand against her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. How many parents had stood in this very precinct, begging for answers that never came? How many times had she herself filed these cases away, telling herself they were cold, unsolvable, gone? Now the truth stared back at her in neat rows of photographs. They hadn't been gone. They had been taken. Kaiser barked once, sharp enough to snap her from her spiral. He stood rigid, his body angled toward the board, his tail stiff. His bark echoed in the empty room like a warning. Mara stepped forward, laying her hand against the board. Her fingers brushed across the rows of faces. She whispered their names softly, one after another. Sierra, Rosie, Anna, Clara. The sound of it broke something inside her, like saying them aloud gave them back a fraction of the life they had been denied. Her hand trembled as she pressed it flat against Clara's photo. She remembered the way the girl's voice had cracked when she whispered monster, the way she clung to her soot-blackened music box as though it were armor. Mara knew now. Clara wasn't just rescued. She had been delivered into the same cycle that had consumed the others. Kaiser's growl deepened, his body tense as he stared at the newest photos. Mara turned to him, her eyes burning. "I know," she whispered. "I know." The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, but the room itself felt suffocating. For a moment, Mara imagined she could hear the lullaby from the music box, faint and tinny, winding its way between the rows of photographs. The melody didn't comfort, it accused. She leaned close to the board, her forehead nearly touching the paper. "We're running out of time," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost a prayer. The words sank heavy into the room, as if the children in the photos had been waiting to hear them all along. Kaiser stepped forward, pressing his head lightly against her hip. The weight of him steadied her, anchored her in the storm. Mara laid her hand on his back, her fingers curling into his fur. Together they faced the board, two living beings staring into 2 decades of silence, vowing that silence would not stretch another year. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and lavender cleaner, but Mara Ellison knew scents like that never masked what lingered in rooms where trauma had unfolded. They couldn't erase the tremor in a child's hands or the shadows behind her eyes. 3 days had passed since Clara Jennings was pulled from the chimney. Color had returned faintly to her cheeks, but her fingers never stilled. She wound the soot-streaked music box again and again until the gears whined. Nurses said she whispered at night, as if speaking to someone no one else could hear. This morning, Mara sat at her bedside. Kaiser lay curled at the foot of the bed, his eyes half shut but vigilant. Near the window, Shelby Jennings stared outward, her silence brittle, as if one word might shatter her. Mara leaned forward, her voice soft. "Clara, sweetheart, I need you to tell me something, only if you're ready." Clara's hands paused, her wide, hollow eyes lifted like a bird singed by fire. "He told me if I moved, the fire would come." Mara's chest tightened. "Who told you that?" "The man." Mara waited. Children's truths came in pieces, pressed too fast and they scattered. Clara shifted under the blanket. His face was like paper, burned. He wore a mask, but it didn't hide it. The words dragged every rumor back. The burned man of Ashford House, the ghost neighbors whispered about. Folklore, Mara had once thought. But Clara's conviction left no room for dismissal. Kaiser stirred, ears twitching. Clara reached down without looking, her hand brushing his fur, like he had always been waiting for her. Mara steadied her voice. "Did he say anything else?" Clara wound the box once more. Its broken lullaby wavered against the heart monitor's steady beep. He said, "The others were waiting for me." Mara froze. "The others? Do you know who?" Clara's gaze drifted to the corner of the room. "They were in the walls. I couldn't see them, but I heard them. They told me not to move, not to scream. They said they were waiting." Her voice fell to a whisper. "They sang so I wouldn't be afraid." Behind Mara, Shelby broke. A sob tore free, raw and involuntary. She turned to the window, fist against her mouth. Clara flinched at the sound, then pressed her face into Kaiser's fur. He shifted closer, letting her ground herself in his steady warmth. Mara brushed a strand of hair from Clara's forehead. "You're safe now," she whispered. But the words felt hollow. Safety wasn't something she could promise. Not when the burned man was more than a story. Not when missing girls still whispered through that house. Clara's muffled words reached her anyway. They're still waiting. Mara gripped the bed rail, her pen frozen above the page. Fire, burned face, others waiting. This wasn't folklore. It was testimony. And testimony meant the cycle wasn't over. Kaiser's chest rumbled with a low growl. His amber eyes met Mara's, steady, unblinking. The case wasn't finished. The lullaby wound down, giving one last strained note before silence. Mara looked at Clara, frail, trembling, alive, and felt the weight of decades press against her. Through Clara, the others were speaking again. She whispered into the quiet, "We're not done. Not yet." Ashford House loomed against the moonlight, its boarded windows rattling, its chimney jutting skyward like a sentinel, daring anyone to look closer. At night, it felt less like a ruin and more like a living thing. Mara eased open the back door. Hinges shrieked. Dust swirled in her flashlight beam. Kaiser padded ahead, nails clicking on warped floorboards, tail stiff, ears locked forward. The staircase groaned under her boots. The air grew heavier with each step, the sour tang of old smoke clinging to the beams. Mara kept her hand near her holster, though she knew no living suspect was waiting here. The house itself resisted her. The attic door was warped and blackened. She shoved her shoulder against it, and it gave way with a groan. Her beam swept across charred rafters and insulation, sagging like melted webs. Kaiser hesitated at the threshold, nose lifted, a growl low in his chest. "It's okay," Mara whispered, though her throat was tight. She crouched, casting her light along the scorched wall. That's when she saw it. Paint. Figures daubed in crude, childlike strokes. Dozens of children holding hands in a circle. At the center was not another child, but a fireplace. Her stomach twisted. Each figure's eyes were black dots, their mouths thin lines, every hand stretched toward the fire. Red letters bled into the plaster around them. Mara read aloud, her breath shallow. "They sleep in the flue." The beam shook. She pressed her palm against the wall. The paint flaked, but the words endured. Kaiser stepped inside, rigid, his nose twitching. Then he froze. Mara followed his gaze. At the base of the mural, smudged handprints pressed into the plaster. Tiny prints, some no bigger than a 5-year-old's, outlined in soot. Her throat closed. Proof of children's hands. Proof Clara hadn't imagined the voices. The mural seemed to pulse under her light. The faces caught between smile and scream. The prickle came then, the certainty of being watched. Kaiser's bark erupted, sharp, aimed at the far corner. The attic threw the sound back at them. Mara whipped her beam across debris and blackened beams. Nothing moved. Her pulse thundered. She crouched, hand on Kaiser's neck. "Easy," she whispered, though her own voice shook. But she didn't believe it. She swept the wall one last time. The children, the fire, the words. This wasn't art. This was instruction. She killed her flashlight. Moonlight bled through the roof cracks, paling the mural, but not erasing it. The words burned in her mind. "They sleep in the flue." "Come on, Kaiser." He didn't move at first. He stared at the wall, growl vibrating steady, as if speaking to something unseen. At last he turned, following her down the stairs. Mara pulled the attic door shut. The latch clicked like a seal. "They weren't sleeping," she whispered into the dark. "They were waiting." The cruiser idled across the street, its headlights off. Ashford House loomed, chimney cutting into the night sky. The boarded windows reflected nothing. The porch sagged like a jaw half open. Mara sat with her coat pulled tight, coffee cooling in the cup holder, untouched. Kaiser was upright in the passenger seat, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the chimney. He hadn't blinked in half an hour. "You're not going to sleep, are you?" Mara asked softly. Kaiser didn't respond. His stare never wavered. Her own eyes drifted back to the chimney. Clara's tiny voice echoed in her memory. The others were waiting. The mural, crude and horrifying. The soot handprints. "The command is painted in red." She rubbed at her temples, trying to shake it, but the image clung. Finally, she whispered, "You think there's still something in there, don't you?" Kaiser growled low, steady, not warning. Certainty. Mara's gut agreed. Forensics had scoured the place, catalogued everything. But the house wasn't empty. Not really. The minutes dragged past midnight. Wind hissed through the trees like whispers. Mara's breath fogged in the chill. Still, Kaiser never eased. She reached over, resting a hand on his back. Tension thrummed through his muscles. He didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the chimney. "I don't know how you do it," she murmured. "Always seeing what we miss." Her chest ached as she remembered. If not for Kaiser, Clara would still be in the dark. Another name on a timeline. Another lullaby sung only to the walls. She looked at the chimney, its bricks cracked and uneven under the streetlight. Rationally, only ash and soot lived inside. But a voice whispered otherwise. "They're still waiting." Kaiser snapped upright, his growl cut sharp, his nose pressed to the glass, fogging it, eyes unblinking on the chimney. Mara's hand went to her holster. Her pulse spiked. "What do you see, boy?" He didn't move. His tail stayed rigid. His body hummed with vigilance. Minutes stretched. Finally his growl faded to a whine, but his gaze never left the house. Mara's throat tightened. "It's still in there, isn't it?" Kaiser turned just enough for his amber eyes to meet hers. No fear in them, only warning. "Then we don't leave," she whispered. They sat until dawn bruised the horizon. Mara's eyes burned, exhaustion pulling at her. Kaiser never wavered. And just as light crept across Maple Hollow Lane, Mara saw it. Faint, impossible, undeniable. From the cracked chimney of Ashford House, a thin thread of smoke curled into the morning sky. The morning sun cast pale lines across Detective Mara Ellison's desk, striping the files spread in chaos. She hadn't slept more than a few hours since Clara Jennings was pulled from the chimney. 24 missing children. 15 never found. The timeline on her board looked less like evidence and more like accusation. Kaiser, her German shepherd, paced restlessly by the door. His nails clicked against tile, as though he too felt the weight of the faces pinned on the corkboard. The phone rang. Mara snatched it up. On the other end was Rachel Hughes, her voice frayed with exhaustion. Rachel's daughter Caitlin had gone missing weeks ago in a neighboring county. The case had barely reached the press. "Detective Ellison, you said you wanted to talk about Caitlin." "I do," Mara said. "Can you come in?" An hour later, Rachel sat across from her, hands white-knuckled around her daughter's photo. She was a woman, hollowed by grief, hair pulled back in haste, eyes rimmed red. Every few minutes, she pulled the photo out again, as though Caitlin might vanish from memory as well as life. "I've told the sheriff everything," Rachel whispered, voice raw. "But there's one thing I didn't. I didn't think it mattered." "Anything could matter," Mara pressed gently. Rachel swallowed. "After the divorce, I was desperate. A woman from church suggested a program, faith-based childcare for mothers in transition. Hearthlight, they called it." Mara's pulse quickened, but she stayed silent. "They sent a man, polite, clean-cut. He said his name was Daniel, but Caitlin didn't call him that. Rachel's lips trembled. She called him Mr. Smoke. She said he smelled like firewood, and the last time, like burned paper. He whispered stories about fires. I trusted him. God help me, I trusted him. Rachel broke, tears spilling. Kaiser padded forward and pressed his head against her knee. Rachel startled, then collapsed into him, sobbing into his fur. When she finally stilled, Mara leaned close, her voice steady. I'm going to find him. This Daniel, Mr. Smoke, won't disappear this time. After Rachel left, Mara ran searches through Hearthlight records. Dozens of Daniels surfaced, but one name repeated, Daniel Rains. His file was thin, scrubbed clean. No photo, no criminal record, only fragments, volunteer listings, unexplained terminations, a misconduct report in Missouri that had gone nowhere. He vanished in 2015, the same year Hearthlight dissolved. Mara whispered the name aloud. Kaiser's ears flicked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. She turned to her board of faces. Sierra, Rosie, Anna, Clara, Caitlin. The pattern was no longer abstract. It had a name. Daniel Rains, she whispered. You've been hiding in the smoke. Now we're coming for you. The road north wound into forest. County records listed the Hearthlight retreat as abandoned. Moss-eaten siding sagged on a lodge, shutters hanging like broken bones. The faint scent of smoke clung to the air. Kaiser leapt from the cruiser, taut with purpose. He pulled Mara past the main lodge toward a sagging tool shed. The padlock was rusted, but recently disturbed. Mara broke it with a crowbar. Inside, only rusted tools and peeling paint cans. But Kaiser ignored it all, clawing at the floor. Beneath the debris, Mara found a hatch. Cold air seeped out, carrying the scent of ash and stone. Flashlight in hand, she descended the narrow steps with Kaiser at her side. The chamber below froze her blood. Childlike drawings covered the stone walls. Suns and stick figures, some frantic, scrawled until the paper tore. In the corner, a filthy cot. A warm impression pressed into the blanket, and atop it, a plastic bead bracelet. Caitlin. Mara's knees buckled. The beads were still warm. Caitlin Hughes, she whispered. Kaiser growled low, gaze locked on the far wall, scrawled in red crayon across the stone. The fire keeps us quiet. Mara radioed for backup, her voice breaking. We've got fresh evidence. A child was kept here, but Caitlin wasn't here now, which meant time was running out. Moonlight silvered the pines as Mara moved through the forest, pistol steady in her grip. Kaiser prowled ahead, low and silent. Dispatch had traced a property still leased under a Hearthlight alias, and Caitlin's bracelet had been warm. The cabin appeared through the trees, roof sagging with moss, faint smoke curling from its chimney. A single flicker of candlelight glowed behind a shutter. Mara crouched behind a woodpile, her breath sharp in the cold. Inside, footsteps paced, and beneath them, a child's muffled whimper. Her heart clenched. Caitlin. The door creaked open. A tall man stepped out, scarf across his face, cigarette glowing in the dark. His movements were calm, unhurried. Daniel Rains. Mr. Smoke. Kaiser launched first, a streak of fur and fury. His snarl ripped the silence as he clamped onto Rains' arm, driving him back. Mara surged forward, weapon raised. Hands in the air! Rains froze, then raised his hands slowly, scarf slipping to reveal eyes that glinted with eerie calm. You finally found me, he rasped. Mara cuffed him hard, shoving him against a tree. Behind her came a muffled cry. She stormed the cabin. Inside, the smell of mildew and smoke. In the corner, a girl wrapped in a filthy blanket, wrists bound with rope, green eyes wide with terror. "Caitlin?" She flinched. "He said I'd go to the fire next." Mara cut the ropes quickly, pulling her close. "Not tonight. You're going home." Kaiser padded to the girl. She buried her hands in his fur, whispering, "The barking dog." Mara lifted Caitlin in her arms, blanket wrapped tight. "You're safe now. Do you hear me? You're safe." From the doorway, Rain's voice carried calm and cruel. "You think this ends with me? The fire never dies. You only caught the smoke." Kaiser lunged again, growl rattling the cabin walls, but Mara pulled him back. She wouldn't give Rains the satisfaction. Deputies would be there any minute. She carried Caitlin into the night. The girl clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder. Kaiser stayed close, eyes locked on Rains until he was hauled away. Later, in the back of Mara's cruiser, Caitlin sat wrapped in a thermal blanket, her small hands twisted into Kaiser's collar. Mara watched her through the mirror, chest heavy with relief and fury. Rain's words echoed in her head. "The fire never dies." Her grip on the wheel tightened. "Then we'll hunt the fire too." Kaiser huffed once, low and steady, as if in answer. For tonight, Caitlin was safe. But Mara knew this was only the beginning. The smoke had led them to the man. Now they had to face the fire. The interrogation room was a coffin of concrete and humming fluorescents. No windows, no clocks. Just a scarred table and 2 chairs. Detective Mara Ellison sat on one side. Daniel Rains cuffed to the table on the other. He looked ordinary, middle-aged, pale under the lights, his hair clipped short. A man you could mistake for a neighbor or teacher, but Mara knew better. She had seen Caitlin Hughes bound and terrified. She had pulled Clara Jennings from a chimney. Monsters didn't always look monstrous. At her side, Kaiser sat rigid, growling low. Rains ignored the dog, his gaze fixed on Mara. "You put a child in a chimney," she said. "I didn't put her anywhere," he murmured. "I was tending the fire." Mara's jaw clenched. "Clara would be dead without us. Caitlin too. Do you understand the trail you've left behind?" Rains leaned back, chains rattling. His voice was calm. "You think you've stopped something. You haven't. You've just interrupted." Kaiser's growl sharpened. Mara steadied him with a hand. "Who else is involved?" "How many children are out there?" Rains looked down, then back at her. "The fire never dies. It only passes hands." Her pen dug into her notebook. "What does that mean?" "It wasn't mine," he whispered. "I only tended it, fed it." "Who started it?" "She." The words sliced the air. Mara's pulse spiked. "She who? Give me a name." "Names are just smoke," he said, eyes gleaming. "She is the fire." Kaiser barked, the sound explosive. Mara forced herself to lean closer. "You've taken children for 20 years. Are you telling me you weren't choosing them?" "I didn't choose," he said serenely. "I delivered." She marked them. She sang to them. The children always knew her voice before they saw her face. Mara froze. Clara's voice echoed in memory. The lady who sang. She scribbled hard. She, fire, singing. Rains leaned forward until the chain pulled taut. His voice was almost reverent. She has always been there, long before me. Long before the house burned. Then why let me catch you? He smiled faintly. Because fire doesn't fear water. It only waits for the wind. Mara shoved her chair back, frustration burning. Kaiser lunged, snarling, teeth bared. Rains didn't flinch. At the door, Mara turned once more. You'll talk, and when you do, I'll burn your fire to the ground. Rains tilted his head, almost pitying. Detective, you don't put out fire. You only move it. Days later, the Hearthlight retreat was quiet. Forensics had swept it clean, files bagged, drawings catalogued. The lodge left to rot. On paper, it was done. But monsters didn't leave everything on paper. A maintenance worker's shovel struck something hollow near the collapsed dining hall. Not stone, not root. Metal. He unearthed a scorched hatch, rusted shut, but scraped by recent use. When Mara arrived, he was pale. Detective, I don't think this was meant to be found. Kaiser growled at the hatch. Mara touched the rusted edge, feeling the wrongness in her bones. Get me a crowbar. It took 3 officers to wrench it open. Soot and stale air poured out. A ladder disappeared into black. Mara clipped her light. Stay topside. Kaiser, with me. The shepherd descended first, paws sure, body tense. Mara followed into a chamber that stank of ash and paper rot. Shelves lined the walls, not tools, files, boxes, photographs sealed in sleeves, binders warped from heat. Her hands trembled as she pulled the first file. Dempsey, Sierra, 2005. School photos. Placement forms stamped Hearthlight Refuge. At the bottom, a note. Transferred to Ashford House. Transferred, like inventory. Another file. Rosie Arian, 2008. Same stamps. Another. Kendra, 2016. Difficult placement. Transferred. Each folder was a life siphoned into silence. Kaiser whined, pawing at spilled folders. Mara gathered them and froze. Inside the lid of one box was a photograph. Children lined up in front of a brick building, forced smiles on their faces. Behind them, half-shadowed, stood a woman. A scarf framed her face, but her eyes were sharp, cutting straight through the lens. On the back, Hearthlight Program, 2012. Coordinator, Margaret Lindell. Mara's stomach dropped. Lindell. The name was stamped all over Ashford House records. The fire of 2014 had supposedly killed her and her husband, Louis. For years, they were ghosts, swallowed by smoke. But here she was. Not gone. Not a victim. Coordinator. Kaiser pressed against Mara's leg, growling. She didn't need him to confirm it, but his instincts hammered the truth home. Margaret Lindell had never burned. She had survived, and she had carried the fire forward. Mara clutched the photograph until her vision blurred. Rains hadn't lied. He wasn't the one. He had only tended. The fire belonged to her. That night, Mara sat alone in her office, the photograph sealed in evidence plastic on her desk. At first glance, it was nothing more than a group photo. But once you saw her, you couldn't unsee her. Margaret Lindell's eyes were alive, intent, daring the camera to remember her. Kaiser stirred, ears pricking. He rose and fixed his gaze not on Mara, but on the photograph. A low growl rumbled, deep and unyielding. Mara's throat tightened. Kaiser had growled at crawl spaces, at chimneys, at Rains himself, but never at a picture. She slid the photo closer. Margaret's eyes caught the fluorescent glare, gleaming faintly. A trick of the gloss, Mara told herself. But the longer she looked, the less sure she became. Kaiser barked once, guttural, lunging until his nose nearly touched the sleeve. His snarl shook the silence. Mara yanked the photo back into a folder. Only then did he ease, though his muscles stayed taut, ears pinned forward. Mara whispered into the quiet, "She's alive." Rain's words came back. "She is the fire." Clara's memory. She sang. Margaret Lindell, long presumed dead, had walked through the blaze and emerged carrying embers in her hands. Mara pressed her palms to her eyes, her voice breaking. "We caught the smoke, but you're still burning." Kaiser sat pressed against her chair, his vigil unbroken, eyes locked on the folder. Mara sank her hand into his fur, drawing strength from his steady warmth. She stared at the name she had written again and again across her notes. Margaret Lindell. The precinct was silent, but Mara could feel it. The weight of footsteps yet to come. The fire wasn't behind them. It was ahead, and the woman who carried it was already in motion. The road narrowed to a dirt path swallowed by pine and oak. Branches scraped the cruiser as Mara Ellison drove into the dark. The dashboard clock glowed past midnight, but time no longer mattered. She wasn't chasing hours. She was chasing Margaret Lindell. Kaiser sat taut beside her, muzzle pressed to the glass, breath fogging the window. His ears twitched, body alive with restless certainty. Mara glanced at him. "You sure about this, boy?" His amber eyes flashed once in the glow, then turned back to the night. His tail thudded once against the seat. Enough. The farmhouse appeared at last, hunched in the clearing like a ruin. Shutters sagged, the fence line drowned in weeds. Yet behind one upstairs curtain, faint candlelight flickered. Mara cut the engine, and silence pressed in heavy. She clipped Kaiser's leash, and he leapt down, landing silent as shadow, his body low, ears forward. Together they crept along the tree line. The house loomed larger, boards grey, roof patched with rusted tin. The air carried a sharp tang beneath the damp earth, smoke. Kaiser froze, stiffening. He pulled her toward the back fence where uneven tracks cut through the grass. A tire rut curved into the mud, fresh against the wild growth. Not abandoned, lived in, hidden in plain sight. Through a curtain, shadows shifted, one tall, one indistinct. Mara's chest tightened. Clara's whisper haunted her. The lady who smelled like smoke. She sang. And Caitlin's plea. He said I'd go in the fire next. Margaret Lindell's eyes stared in her memory from that decade-old photograph, sharp and alive. The farmhouse groaned. A floorboard creaked. A shadow crossed the curtain, then vanished. Mara pressed low against the fence. She's in there. Kaiser's growl deepened, his nose lifting toward the chimney. The air itself seemed to thrum. Mara whispered into his ear, "Easy. Stay low." They crossed the yard. The porch sagged, shutters rattling in the cold wind. Kaiser halted at the base of the steps, growling at the glowing upstairs window. Mara steadied her pistol, exhaled. She's here. The front door groaned open. Mara swept her light through gloom, thick with dust and candle wax. Smoke clung to the boards like breath. Kaiser padded first, paws silent, body pressed low. His hackles rose as they followed cleaner footprints down the hall. The smell of smoke grew sharper. At the end, a door hung ajar, flickering light spilling through. Mara pushed it open. Her breath caught. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of children. School portraits, birthday snapshots, Polaroids curled at the edges. Beneath each, a name scrawled in jagged red. Sierra, Rosie, Anna, Clara, Caitlin, and dozens more. Mara's beam trembled. This wasn't evidence. It was worship, a shrine to silence. Her light froze on an empty frame at the center. Beneath it, one word, Madison, 2027. Her stomach lurched, a name claimed before the year had even arrived. On the floor lay trinkets arranged like offerings, a ribbon, a cracked doll, a tiny shoe, each tagged with a year, each tied to a face on the wall. Kaiser snarled suddenly, lunging toward the window. His bark shook dust from the rafters. Shadows slipped through the tree line outside, deliberate, controlled, watching. Mara's chest constricted. She spun back to the shrine. The photographs pressed in, eyes staring, as though Margaret herself had stood here countless times, whispering promises to the fire. The candles guttered, their flames shrinking as if choked by a draught. The window rattled faintly. Kaiser barked again, furious, his claws scraping wood. Mara whispered into the dark. "Margaret Lindell, you've been hiding all this time." The words felt dangerous, as though speaking them fed the flame. Her gaze locked again on the empty frame. Another child marked. Another future stolen. She pressed a hand into Kaiser's fur, grounding herself. Not again. Never again. The farmhouse door slammed behind them. A figure bolted into the clearing, scarf whipping, a small metal box clutched tight. "Police!" "Stop!" Mara shouted, surging forward. Margaret Lindell didn't stop. She ran like the woods themselves obeyed her, sure-footed, fast, as though she'd rehearsed this escape. Kaiser ripped free, a streak of fury. Mara followed, boots pounding. Branches clawed, smoke clung, the forest swallowing them whole. "Stop!" Mara cried. "It's over, Margaret!" Margaret shrieked back, her voice raw and unearthly. "You don't understand. The fire never dies." The words tore through Mara's chest like ice. Not denial. Creed. Kaiser closed in. His barks rose, feral and unstoppable. Margaret glanced back, eyes blazing, before he leapt. The impact was brutal. They crashed into the underbrush. The box tumbled from her grasp. Kaiser pinned her, teeth inches from her face, growling, rolling like thunder. Mara skidded to a halt, weapon raised. "Kaiser, hold!" The shepherd froze, rigid but obedient, pressing her into the dirt. Margaret writhed, her scarf slipping, revealing scorched hair and creased, smoke-seared skin. Her eyes burned with the same fire Mara had seen in the photograph. "You fools," she spat. "You think you can chain flames? Fire waits. It always waits." Mara kicked the metal box shut with her boot. Its lid had sprung open, spilling slips of paper. She forced herself to look. Each bore a child's name in red scrawl. Some she knew. Others were strangers. At the top, bold and fresh, Madison, 2027. 3 more followed. Future dates. Future children. Her throat constricted. How many, Margaret? How many more? Margaret's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. As many as it takes to keep the fire alive. Kaiser pressed harder, his growl shaking the ground. Mara stepped closer, cuffs ready, her voice sharp. Not anymore. It ends tonight. For the first time, Margaret's confidence cracked. Fear flickered, but her zeal returned just as fast. She laughed, ragged, her voice splitting the night. You caught smoke before. You'll think this is victory. But fire doesn't die in chains. It spreads. Mara snapped the cuffs around her wrists, steel biting. Margaret whispered hoarsely, You've chained me, not the fire. Dragging her upright, Mara tucked the box beneath her arm. Kaiser pressed against her side, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. As they moved back toward the clearing, the forest seemed to listen, Margaret's words echoing through the trees. Mara glanced at the box. The names inside were heavier than evidence. They were warnings. Her jaw clenched. Not while I'm breathing. Kaiser huffed low, leaning into her leg, steady as ever. His silence spoke for them both. They emerged into the clearing, farmhouse lights flickering weakly behind. Mara didn't look back. She didn't need to. Margaret Lindell had been caught, but the fire she worshipped still smoldered. And with Kaiser at her side, Mara swore it would never rise again. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, but beneath it lingered something sharper, the weight of grief made tangible. By dawn, the steps outside were already lined with reporters, cameras flashing in hungry bursts as families filed past. Microphones thrust forward, questions barked into the morning air. But few answers came. Most of the families simply held tighter to the hands of those they still had left. Inside, the benches creaked under the weight of parents, siblings, neighbors, faces drawn and sleepless, eyes rimmed red. Some clutched photographs of children lost years before, smiles frozen in glossy stillness. Others gripped one another with white-knuckled desperation. At the prosecution's table, Detective Mara Ellison sat stiff-backed, her badge clipped to her blazer. Beside her lay Kaiser, his head lifted, ears angled, amber eyes alert. Technically, he wasn't allowed inside, but no one objected. Everyone knew he had earned his place here. The double doors creaked. "All rise," the bailiff called. Margaret Lindell entered. Shackled at the wrists, her scarf still tight around her head, she moved with a calmness that felt obscene. She did not bow her head in shame. She swept the room with her eyes and met the family's glares without blinking, her gaze sharp enough to cut. Kaiser growled low, the vibration carrying through the floorboards. Mara steadied him with a hand on his back, though her own pulse hammered in rhythm with his tension. Margaret folded her hands at the defense table, as though at a sermon. The gavel struck, and formalities filled the air. But for the gallery, the rituals of law were background noise, their eyes fixed on the woman who had stolen so much. In the front row, Clara Jennings sat between her parents. She clutched a music box like it was a lifeline. Her unicorn hoodie was gone, replaced with a simple dress, but the shadows beneath her eyes remained. Beside her, Caitlin Hughes leaned against her mother, freckles stark against skin still pale from weeks of fear. When the charges were read, kidnapping, conspiracy, homicide, the list seemed endless. Each word landed like a stone in the chest. Families wept quietly, shoulders shaking. Margaret never blinked. The prosecution placed a box of recovered evidence in the center of the courtroom. Inside were slips of paper, each marked with a child's name and future date. Gasps rippled as parents recognized the handwriting. One father stood suddenly, shouting, "That's my daughter's name!" before his wife pulled him back down. The judge's gavel cracked for order, but the horror had already spilled into the room. Mara's gaze stayed locked on Margaret, searching for a flicker of remorse. None came. Instead, she caught the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of Margaret's mouth. Kaiser shifted, growl deepening. Margaret didn't look at him, but her serenity felt deliberate, like a performance for him alone. The first witness was called. The gallery braced. "Clara Jennings," the prosecutor said softly. A hush fell as Clara rose, impossibly small against the cavernous room. She carried her music box to the stand, her feet dangling above the floor as she swore the oath. Her mother gave her hand one last squeeze before stepping back. The prosecutor crouched to her eye level. "Clara, can you tell us what you remember from the night you were found?" Her eyes darted toward her parents, then Mara, then the music box. She whispered, "He told me, if I moved, the fire would come." Gasps rippled. Mothers clutched children tighter. Fathers bowed their heads. "Who told you that?" the prosecutor asked. The man with the burned face. His mask looked like paper. Clara's voice faltered, her eyes brimming. "But there was a lady too." The gallery stirred. Mara felt her stomach knot. "Can you tell us more about the lady?" Clara's gaze drifted to Margaret at the defense table. Shackled, scarf wound tight, Margaret met the child's eyes with calm composure. Clara whimpered, shrinking into her chair. "She smelled like smoke," Clara whispered. "Always. Even when she whispered, sometimes she sang to us. From the chimney. A lullaby. The others, they sang too." The words split the gallery wide open. Families sobbed, hands pressed over mouths. Mara's throat tightened, her hand pressing harder on Kaiser's fur. "The others?" the prosecutor asked gently. "The other girls? They told me not to be afraid, but they never came out." The judge called for order, but grief roared too loudly to be contained. Clara's mother rushed to the stand, gathering her child, the music box chiming faintly as she carried her back to the gallery. Then came Caitlin Hughes. Guided by her mother's hand, she climbed onto the chair, twisting her fingers in her lap. Her voice trembled. "He said I'd go in the fire next." The room stilled. Even Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. "He made me sit in the dark, said the walls would keep me safe. But then, she came." "Who came, Caitlin?" "The lady. She smelled like smoke, like the fireplace when it's burned all night. She sang, but—" Caitlin's voice broke. "She didn't like when I cried. She said quiet was the only way the fire wouldn't come." Gasps cut through the gallery. One mother clutched her husband's sleeve so hard the fabric tore. Caitlin wiped her tears and whispered the words that chilled the room. Sometimes the walls whispered back. The girls, they sang the same song. Silence pressed down heavy as stone. Margaret looked not at Caitlin, but at Kaiser. For the first time, her calm cracked, a twitch at the mouth, a narrowing of her eyes. Kaiser rose, growl sharp and violent. Mara gripped his leash, grounding them both. Caitlin's mother swept her child back into her arms, sobbing into her hair as they returned to their seats. Families reached out to touch them, whispering thanks. Mara sat frozen. She had heard confessions, lies, and twisted truths before, but nothing pierced like the words of these two children. The lady who smelled like smoke, the lullabies from chimneys. Proof: Margaret wasn't just a figure from old case files. She was fired herself. The judge called the next witness, but Mara's mind was already elsewhere. The fire hadn't been extinguished. It had only been named. By nightfall, the courthouse emptied slowly, families clinging to one another in echoing halls. Reporters clustered outside, their flashbulbs stinging the dusk. Mara pushed through them with Kaiser at her side, the shepherd parting the crowd like a living shield. At her cruiser, tucked beneath a flickering streetlight, she stopped cold. A slip of paper was wedged beneath her windshield wiper. Kaiser growled instantly, his body taut, ears locked forward. Mara's throat tightened. She approached cautiously, one hand brushing her holster. The paper fluttered in the breeze, ordinary yet electric with menace. She plucked it free. Jagged handwriting cut across the page. The fire never left. You only chained the spark. Her breath hitched. She scanned the lot. Empty cars, shifting trees, the hum of a power line. No one was visible, yet the weight of eyes pressed on her. Kaiser barked suddenly, lunging toward the tree line, his teeth bared. Mara's heart slammed, but when she followed his gaze, she saw nothing but swaying branches and shadow. She crumpled the note in her fist, the edges biting her palm. Whoever had left it had been close enough to touch her car, close enough to remind her Margaret Lindell was not the end. Crouching, Mara pressed her forehead briefly to Kaiser's, steadying them both. "We're not done," she whispered. "Not even close." The wind shifted. For a moment, unmistakable, came the sharp scent of burned wood, not memory, present, carried on the night air. Mara slid the note into an evidence bag, hands trembling, and climbed into the cruiser with Kaiser. She didn't start the engine right away. Instead, she sat in the silence, staring into the shadows. You only chained the spark. Her hand found Kaiser's head, his amber eyes meeting hers. She whispered, more vow than reassurance. "We'll hunt it. Together." The headlights swept across the empty lot. The streetlight flickered once, and in the tree line she thought she saw the faintest shimmer of movement. A scarf, a silhouette. Then it was gone. But the scent of smoke lingered. And Mara knew. The trial had been one battle. The war was only beginning. The children's recreation room smelled faintly of crayons and soap, the kind of clean hospitals tried to impose everywhere. But here, tucked away on the pediatric floor, there was color. Posters of cartoon animals taped to the walls, paper chains sagging across the windows. Beyond them, an autumn sky deepened into gold. At a table near the glass, two girls sat shoulder to shoulder. Clara Jennings bent over a coloring book, carefully shading a unicorn's mane sky blue. Beside her, Caitlin Hughes pressed her crayon so hard it threatened to snap, tongue poking out in concentration. Her page was a stormy sky, messy and over-dark, but she didn't care. For once, she could color loudly, scribble as she pleased, without fear of someone ordering silence. Their crayons bumped. Both looked up, and laughter bubbled free. Clara tilted her music box closer so Caitlin could trace the painted flowers on its lid. She had clutched it through every hour since the night she was found. But now she was learning to share. Across the room, their mothers watched from mismatched armchairs pulled close together. Shelby Jennings dabbed her eyes with a tissue worn thin. Rachel Hughes gripped a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Their hands rested together, grief and gratitude braided in the space between them. "Look at them," Shelby whispered, her voice breaking. "They should never have met this way. But they found each other." Rachel's fingers closed around hers. "They'll heal together. That has to count for something." The door creaked. Both girls' heads snapped up. Kaiser entered first, paws whispering across the linoleum. His frame filled the doorway, tail swaying slow and steady. Not the frantic wag of joy, but the gentle rhythm of a sentinel who knew this was sacred ground. Behind him came Detective Mara Ellison, her face weary, but softened by a rare smile that reached her eyes. "Clara," the girl squealed, dropping her crayon. "Kaiser!" Caitlin shouted at the same time. They bolted, bare feet slapping against the floor. Kaiser crouched as they collided with him, their arms flung around his neck, faces buried in his fur. He stood still, letting them cling, tail brushing the air in patient arcs. He tilted his head as if listening, to their breaths, to the fragile rhythm of survival he had helped preserve. "You found me," Clara whispered into his chest. "You saved me too," Caitlin added, muffled in his shoulder. Their mothers wept openly now. Shelby pressed her face into her hands. Rachel reached forward, stroking Clara's hair, even as her own tears fell. Mara stood at the doorway, her throat closing. She had seen too many endings where silence triumphed. But this was what survival looked like. Children laughing, coloring, clinging to a dog who had never once let them down. Kaiser closed his eyes, leaning into their embrace. For the first time in days, the tension in his body eased, his chest rising with a long sigh. The girls pulled back enough to meet his gaze. Clara stroked his ears with a tenderness that belonged to someone much older. Caitlin laid her palm over his chest, feeling the thrum of his heart. "He's our hero," Clara said softly. "No," Caitlin corrected, lifting her eyes to Mara. "He's everyone's hero." Mara's vision blurred. She crossed the room and crouched beside them, her hand pressing into Kaiser's fur. "He is," she whispered, voice breaking. "And so are you." The girls hugged him tighter. Kaiser huffed contentedly, eyelids heavy as though the world was finally safe, if only for this moment. Their mothers joined them on the floor, arms folding around daughters and shepherd alike. The music box clicked open in Clara's lap, spilling a trembling lullaby into the room. It was the same melody Mara had read about in case files, the same tune children said whispered through chimneys. But here, played against laughter and tears, it no longer belonged to nightmares. It belonged to the living. Mara sat back on her heels and let herself breathe. Healing would never be clean, never complete, but it was real. Outside, leaves spiraled on the wind, red and gold against a clearing sky. Inside, two children colored side by side. Two mothers wept, and at the heart of it lay Kaiser, steadfast as stone, gentle as breath. For one fragile evening, fire had yielded to light. Night gathered across the highway, the asphalt ribbon glowing pale under the cruiser's beams. Mara drove with one hand on the wheel, the other slack on her thigh, her body moving on instinct. Headlights carved through drifting leaves. Her mind replayed fragments. The gavel's crack, Clara's whisper, Caitlin's trembling voice, Margaret Lindell's unblinking stare. Each pressed against her chest until her ribs ached. From the back seat came a shift of weight. Kaiser stretched forward, his head settling on her shoulder. Mara startled, then exhaled, smiling faintly. "Hey, partner?" she murmured, brushing his fur. Warmth anchored her in a way nothing else could. The cruiser rolled through a sleeping town, neon from a lone diner sign flickering across empty pavement. For a heartbeat, Mara imagined a normal life. Families finishing late dinners, children tucked safe in bed. No memories of chimneys or songs in the walls. She longed for it. But her world didn't allow it. Kaiser's weight pressed firmer against her shoulder, as if to remind her vigilance was their life. "You know it's not over," she said softly. His amber eyes glinted in the dashboard light, unblinking, answering without words. Her grip on the wheel tightened. The fire never left. "You only chained the spark." The note's words burned in her pocket. She thought of the names Margaret had kept, written like prophecies. Children who hadn't yet vanished, already claimed in red ink. Madison, 2027. But then her mind returned to the hospital room. Clara and Caitlin, breathing, coloring, alive because Kaiser had refused to let go. Her voice cracked. "They're here because of you." Kaiser's tail thumped once, deliberate. His eyes never closed, even as he leaned into her, even as farmland stretched silent beyond the glass. Mara let a few tears fall, the road shimmering until the wipers cleared her view. "You're more than my partner," she whispered. "You're the reason I keep standing." The highway opened into fields and barns rising like black monuments against the horizon. Damp air slipped through the vents, carrying wood smoke. Mara shivered. Even ordinary firelight felt tainted now. She slowed, unwilling to rush the night. No radios blared, no sirens chased, only the hum of wheels and the quiet weight of the shepherd beside her. Kaiser lifted his head, scanning the darkness, then lowered it back onto her shoulder, with a sigh that filled the cabin like a benediction. Mara smiled faintly. "We'll be ready when it rises again," she said. "But tonight, you rest." Her hand found his paw stretched across the seat, squeezing it gently. The road stretched ahead, endless, but no longer bleak. Tonight, she wasn't just driving home. She was carrying hope. Her apartment sat above a laundromat, whose machines hummed softly into the night. She had chosen it for anonymity, a place where no one asked questions. Tonight, even the hinges of the door creaked louder, as though the walls knew what she carried home. Kaiser padded inside, nails clicking against the hardwood. He shook once, tags jingling, then moved methodically through each room, nosing corners, checking shadows. Only after he circled back to her side did his body ease. Mara set her keys in the bowl, her jacket on the hook. The clock ticked past midnight. She poured water, left it untouched. In the glass reflection, her face looked older, eyes bruised with fatigue. She wondered how much of her life had been spent chasing ghosts. She turned toward the window. Kaiser had already stationed himself there, his frame etched against the curtain by the laundromat's flickering sign. His ears twitched, his gaze fixed on the empty street below. Mara crouched beside him, pressing a hand into his side. "You never stop, do you?" she whispered. He didn't move. His posture was carved from vigilance. She followed his gaze. The street looked ordinary. Parked cars, leaves tumbling across the sidewalk, street lamps humming. But she knew darkness didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it left notes. Her throat tightened. She leaned close to his ear. When the fire rises again, we'll be ready. Kaiser's tail tapped once against the floor, steady as a drumbeat, but his gaze didn't waver. Mara settled onto the couch with a blanket, refusing the bed. She wanted to stay near him, near the window. Kaiser glanced back once, then returned to his vigil, ears cutting the night. Her eyelids grew heavy, but even in near sleep she felt secure, because Kaiser was awake, because he was watching. Outside, the city breathed its ordinary breath. Inside, a shepherd sat against the glass, unwavering. Not fearful, vigilant. And just as Mara's eyes closed, a single ash drifted down outside the window, settling soundless against the pane. Sometimes the hardest stories remind us of the simplest truths, that love, loyalty, and quiet companionship can hold us together when nothing else does. A German shepherd like Kaiser doesn't measure life by victories or failures. He measures it by presence, by staying, by protecting. And maybe that's why their bond with us feels so profound. They stand where the world grows dark, so we don't have to face it alone. If you've ever felt that unspoken connection with your own dog, you already know how much it means. And if you'd like to explore ways to deepen that bond, whether through training, shared routines, or simply understanding them a little better, I've found a resource that touched me deeply. I'll leave it here for you to explore at your own pace. Take it as a gentle suggestion from one dog lover to another. No pressure, just something that might help you and your companion share even more of the good years ahead. Because in the end, every wag of the tail, every watchful glance, is a reminder that love really can keep us safe.